Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are attempting to put our finger on, well, maybe the single greatest mystery in existence.
It's a big one.
It really is. It's the question that, launched philosophy thousands of years ago, and now today it defines the future of artificial intelligence, of medicine.
Yeah.
What is it actually like to be conscious?
It truly is the ultimate mystery, and it's why scientists and philosophers are kind of locked in this high-stakes battle right now. We're using a stack of sources that takes us right from the classic philosophical mind-body problem.
Which David Chalmers famously called the hard problem.
Exactly, the hard problem. And we're connecting it directly to cutting-edge neuroscience and, all the ethical questions about technology and life support.
Right, so our mission today is a bit nuanced. We're not aiming for the perfect single definition of consciousness because, well, frankly, that doesn't exist yet.
Not even close.
Instead, we want to understand why that subjective feeling, that really personal, internal, what it is like part, is so stubbornly resistant to our best objective scientific explanations. We're going to cover everything. We're talking sonar-guided bats, premature babies, the promise of Neuralink, and the ethical dread of the philosophical zombie.
And crucially, we have to look beyond just the biology. We have to look at how we, as these intensely social animals, decide who or what even gets to be included in what the sources call the mind club.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, because the research is pretty clear that often that decision is based on culture, on your relationship to the thing, on a moral choice, not just on biological facts.
Okay, let's unpack this right away. We absolutely have to start where modern research really began. That's Thomas Nagel's influential 1974 essay, What is it like to be a bat?
Yes.
And if you're just joining us on this topic, the single thought experiment it's the absolute symbol of the explanatory gap.
It is. Nagel's insight is so simple, but it's incredibly powerful, and it's a fundamental challenge to physicalism, the idea that everything can be, reduced entirely to physical laws. He introduced this concept of the subjective character of experience.
Right.
This is the first-person perspective, the what it is like part of being you or being a bat. And Nagel argued that while science thrives on objective facts...
The facts that anyone can access from a third-person view.
Exactly. But experience is inherently perspective-dependent.
So I'm following the physicalist challenge here.
Yeah.
Science says if we know all the physical facts about the universe, we know everything there is to know.
That's the idea.
So consciousness must be just another physical fact, right?
That's the core claim of reductionism. And Nagel uses the bat to just dismantle it. Think about the bat's reality. We can dissect it, we can map its entire central nervous system, we can fully understand its echolocation system.
You mean how it sends out those high-frequency sounds and builds a map from the echoes?
Precisely. We can see how the time delay and the phase shifts of the returning echoes get interpreted by the auditory cortex to form a spatial map of its environment. We can know the entire physical mechanism.
We know how the biology works, down to the last neuron firing. We have the objective data set.
Absolutely. We can know every single objective physical fact out the bat. We could know the precise neural firing patterns when it successfully identifies, say, a flying moth versus a wall. But here is the devastating question. Does knowing all those objective physical facts tell us the subjective feeling of being the bat experiencing that reality? Can we know the inner quality, the qualia of its sonar-based three-dimensional world?
I mean, I can try to simulate it, right? I could put on a visor that translates sound into visual maps for me.
But you're still using your human visual architecture to interpret a simulated sonar experience.
Right. I haven't actually stopped being a human and started being a bat. My brain is still a human brain.
Exactly. Our experience of the world is primarily visual and tactile. It's structured by light waves. The bat's world is structured by sound waves and movement. And Nagel's claim is that this subjective quality is just non-reductive. It cannot be fully captured or reduced to the objective physical facts we gather.
This is such a crucial point. Let's just elaborate on that. If I perfectly know the frequency and the amplitude of the light wave that hits my retina when I look at a fire engine, that is the objective fact.
Yes.
Why does that fail to capture the qualia, the experience of redness?
Because the feeling of redness is intrinsically tied to your personal subjective processing system. It's an interpretation. If you try to understand redness by only studying light waves, you miss the very thing you're trying to understand, which is the private internal awareness.
Okay.
And Nagel says that's what we do with consciousness. We gather all this third-person data, the brain scans, the neuron activity, but the first-person experience just remains outside that physical description. And if you can't account for the first-person experience, then physicalism has failed to explain consciousness fully.
That sets the table perfectly for the famous cousin of the bat, the philosophical zombie, or P-zombie, which was popularized by David Chalmers and is discussed a lot in the Mind Club.
Right.
We often hear the bat and zombie mentioned in the same breath, but they attack the problem from slightly different angles. And I think that distinction is really important for understanding this whole debate.
It is, and what's fascinating is their shared goal, which is highlighting this explanatory gap. Both concepts share the core idea that, something is missing from a purely physical description of a conscious being.
So let's nail down the P-zombie definition first. What is it?
The P-zombie is a thought experiment. It proposes a being that is atomically, structurally, and behaviorally identical to a human being. They react to stimuli, they laugh at jokes, they apologize when they bump into you, and they say, ouch, if they prick their finger.
Okay.
But internally, they lack any subjective feeling, any what it is like quality. They're behaviorally perfect replicas, but they are just internally empty. They're a machine.
I have to ask the obvious question here. If they say ouch when they trick their finger, why isn't that proof of pain?
Because the P-zombie only simulates the human reaction. If you prick a P-zombie, the pain signal travels up the nervous system, it activates the specific cortical pain regions, and that causes the P-zombie's motor cortex to initiate the withdrawal reflex.
And the vocal cords make the ouch sound.
Exactly. It all happens just as it would in a human, but the subjective feeling of suffering, the dread, the discomfort, the qualia is completely absent.
So the P-zombie attacks physicalism by showing that if you can perfectly replicate all the physical facts and still conceive of the absence of consciousness, then consciousness must be something added to the physical world, not just a part of it.
Yes, it makes consciousness seem like this kind of ghostly extra ingredient. It tries to prove that consciousness is logically separable from the physical.
Okay, so then how does the bat differ? The Mind Club gives us a good framework for this, using the concepts of agency and experience.
That framework is perfect for this. It provides the critical distinction. So, agency is the capacity to act, to plan, and to exert control.
To do things.
To do things.
Yeah.
And experience is the capacity to feel, to perceive, to have subjective sensations.
Okay, so the P-zombie has high agency. It navigates the world, holds a job, drives a car, but it has zero experience. It's a purely functional machine.
Right. But the bat is completely different. We assume the bat does have experience. It's alive, it feels its world, it navigates a subjective reality that is intensely meaningful to it. The bat is definitely not a zombie.
Yeah.
But here's the problem. When we try to study the bat objectively, our scientific tools can only treat its behavior and its internal states like we would treat a zombie's.
What do you mean by that?
We can measure its neural response to a stimulus, which is a physical fact. We can see its reaction time, we can understand its function, its agency, but we remain scientifically blind to the first-person perspective, the content of its subjective experience. The problem isn't the bat's existence. The issue is that our objective third-person methodology is inherently inadequate for accessing first-person reality.
So Nagel's critique is about the limits of our scientific methods, whereas Chalmers' critique with the P-zombie is about the nature of physical reality itself.
That's the perfect way to put it.
That raises a huge imperative for researchers then. If objective reductionism is fundamentally inadequate, does research just stop? Do we all just throw up our hands and become dualists?
No, not at all. Actually, Nagel's paper, while it was devastating to pure physicalism, was really a call to arms for new methodologies. He didn't say, stop researching. He said, your current tools are inadequate for the job. And the response was, well, it was basically threefold, leading to the new frameworks that academia is pursuing today.
What's the most conceptual of these new approaches?
The one Nagel himself sort of hinted at, objective phenomenology. If we can't reduce the content of consciousness to physical facts, maybe we can objectify its structure.
Structure versus content. Let's elaborate on that a bit more for everyone listening.
Sure. Imagine two people looking at the same landscape. The content is what they see. The colors, the specific shapes of the trees, the clouds, that content is purely subjective.
My green might not be your green.
Exactly. But the structure of their experience might be identical. They both experience a visual field. They both sense the flow of time passing. They both feel their perspective is centered here, looking out. Objective phenomenologists are trying to develop a conceptual language, even mathematical frameworks, to describe the structure of the subjective experience itself.
So they're trying to find the universal rules of subjective reality, regardless of whether you're a human, a bat,
Uh-huh.
maybe an advanced AI.
Precisely. It's an incredibly abstract approach, I'll grant you, but it's an attempt to study the subjective as an object in its own right, without just reducing it back down to neuron firing.
Okay, let's move to the second one, which is much more of a scientific theory that tries to actually calculate consciousness. Integrated Information Theory, or IIT. This is the cornerstone of Christoph Koch's work.
Right, and IIT is less interested in the qualitative content, the redness, the taste, and more interested in the quantity and the mechanism of consciousness. It was developed primarily by Giulio Tononi, and it attempts to define consciousness based on the structural properties of how information is integrated within a system. The key metric here is something called phi, the Greek letter phi.
Phi. Okay, tell us about phi. How does a single number capture something as slippery as consciousness?
Well, phi measures the degree to which a system's current state is determined by its own past states and how much it limits its own future states. I mean, more specifically, it measures the system's capacity for causal structure.
Causal structure.
A system with high phi is one where the elements are so richly interconnected and integrated that the whole system generates more information than the sum of its parts. If you break the system in two, the consciousness disappears or drops dramatically because you've lost those causal relationships.
Can you give us an analogy for that?
Yeah, think of a computer chip versus a bucket of sand. A computer chip has billions of transistors. If you change the state of one transistor, it causally impacts the states of many others in a really complex, highly differentiated, and highly integrated way.
Okay.
But if you pour a bucket of sand, changing the position of one grain has almost no causal impact on the position of the other grains. The chip has high phi, the sand has zero. IIT proposes that consciousness is that high degree of integrated causal information structure.
So we may never know what it's like to be the bat, but if we could perfectly map its brain structure and calculate a high-phi score, we would know how much consciousness it has, say, relative to a chimpanzee or a flatworm.
That's the core claim. It gives us an objective measure of a subjective reality.
It's an incredible idea.
It is. It fundamentally treats consciousness as a property of physical organization, not just a consequence of complex computation. It suggests consciousness is widespread in nature, wherever matter organizes itself, to create these complex causal structures.
And finally, the third approach, the most pragmatic and experimental path, the search for the neural correlates of consciousness, the NCCs.
This is the massive ongoing project in neuroscience, led by people like Stanislas Dehaene, who is Koch's main rival. They believe in mapping the easy problem, the correlations.
So, which neurons fire when you feel joy? Which brain regions light up when you see a face?
Exactly. They are meticulously mapping the physical event, the neural activity, to the mental event, the experience.
And the hope is that if we map enough of these correlations, we'll eventually find the mechanism, the rule that connects them.
It's an act of empirical faith, really. If we can find the precise conditions under which neural activity reliably gives rise to subjective experience, the mechanism of the hard problem, the rule that bridges the gap, must eventually reveal itself. It grounds the whole discussion firmly in measurable, objective brain activity.
Okay, let's take those measurable, objective brain activities and connect them to the future. We've seen incredible advancements in brain-computer interface technology, BCI, specifically from Neuralink.
Right.
We've seen quadriplegics move cursors, type, and control robotic arms using only their thoughts with these implanted chips. So the question is, if we can successfully connect the physical brain to a digital system for functional output, doesn't that just validate the physicalist model and make the singularity ray Kurzweil's vision of uploading consciousness a certainty?
It's a very natural question to ask, but we have to be incredibly careful about the definitions of success here. The Neuralink achievement, while it is astounding, is primarily a testament to solving the problem of localization.
Tell us more about localization in this context. What do you mean?
Well, motor function is maybe the most clearly and reliably mapped function in the human brain. This is the famous homunculus, that visual map of the body that's kind of plastered across the motor cortex. If I want to move my hand, a highly specific, localized area of the motor cortex generates a specific electrical signal. And because the function is so localized, BCI becomes an input-output problem, an I/O problem, solved by decoding those electrical signals. The chips are reading the intent to move, which is an electrical communication channel.
So the success with BCI proves that certain localized functions are just communication pathways we can hack into,
Yes.
but doesn't prove that consciousness itself is localized.
That's the key skepticism toward the singularity. The leap from functional BCI to uploading the self is enormous. And why? Because the feeling of being me, of seeing red, of having a complex subjective experience,
Yeah.
that is almost certainly not a localized function. There is no single address, no homunculus for your entire self that a chip can just extract or copy.
So if the motor function is like a clearly labeled telephone line, the experience of consciousness is more like a global emergent communication network involving the entire city.
That's a perfect analogy. The prevailing view, supported by both global workspace theory and IIT, is that consciousness is emergent. It arises from the complex, massive, nonlinear interaction of the entire neural network. It's not stored in one place. It is the unified process of the network operating as a whole.
So let's deepen that orchestra analogy we touched on. What does it mean for the singularity if consciousness is a symphony, not just one instrument?
Well, if BCI success is like putting a microphone on one highly skilled musician, the motor cortex, to amplify its sound, the singularity requires capturing the harmony, the atmosphere, the emergent quality of the whole symphony.
You can't just mic the first violin and say you've captured the symphony?
No. You need to capture the real-time causal structure, the feedback loops, the massive integration that makes the symphony more than the sum of its parts. Currently, Neuralink is focused on input-output efficiency. It's functionally excellent. But functionally excellent BCI does not equate to capturing the self.
This brings us to a really critical distinction: functional integration versus ontological integration. This feels like where the whole concept of digital immortality hangs in the balance.
It is. It's the most philosophical challenge posed by BCI. We are rapidly achieving functional integration. We can connect the brain to AI, allowing access to petabytes of data, accelerated calculations, seamless external memory. We can become functionally enhanced cyborgs.
Our computational power just expands exponentially.
Right. But the philosophical challenge remains. Does the AI's memory become my memory? Does the fusion of data guarantee the fusion of self?
This is the ontological integration problem, and it hits that classic philosophical paradox of the ship of Theseus.
Exactly. The ship of Theseus, a wooden ship whose planks are replaced one by one over time. Eventually, is it still the same ship?
Right.
So apply that to the mind. If we slowly replace your biological neurons with synthetic digital replicas that perform the exact same function, atom for atom, signal for signal, at what point does your consciousness transfer to the digital substrate?
Or does it?
Or does the subjective experience just blink out the moment the original biological substrate is fully replaced?
The functionalist would argue that if the behavior and the input-output are identical, then the consciousness must be identical. The experience is just the software.
But the physicalists, especially those who champion IIT like Koch, would argue that consciousness is not merely the software, the functional information, but a property of the hardware's causal structure. The silicon substrate, even if it runs the identical code, does not possess the same inherent causal structure, the same integrated information as the biological wetware.
So the actual material matters. If consciousness is emergent from biology, then digitizing the data is just creating a copy, a highly complex simulation, but not transferring the original experience.
That's why Koch's quote is so important here. He famously said, simulating a black hole perfectly doesn't make the computer suck in surrounding space.
Right.
Simulation is not instantiation. Functional expansion gives us incredible computational power, but it does not guarantee ontological integration or digital immortality. We may become powerful cyborgs, but that subjective what it is like feeling is still dependent on the unique integrated biological mechanism of the brain. The question persists. What is it like to be this AI-linked human? And is that unique feeling lost if the substrate changes?
The subjective experience we've been talking about, the qualia, it often comes to a head when we talk about pain. Pain is arguably the most powerful and distinct criterion for defining consciousness, the unavoidable evidence that an internal reality exists and is suffering. But when we look at the boundaries of human life, at its beginning and its end, the definition of consciousness just breaks down. And that creates these profound ethical and medical dilemmas.
This is the premature infant paradox. It's a deeply uncomfortable area where neuroscience meets ethics, and we're forced to ask, when does the ability to consciously suffer actually begin? Medical consensus suggests the thalamocortical pathway. That's the necessary physical connection for the cerebral cortex to cognitively perceive and register pain as suffering forms functionally between 24 and 28 weeks of gestation.
Okay, so if that pathway isn't structurally complete, the pain impulse might be registered, but it isn't consciously felt or interpreted as suffering in the way an adult understands it.
Precisely. Which means if we use conscious pain perception as the baseline for consciousness, then a 23-week-old premature infant, though clearly alive and requiring intensive medical support, would be considered neurologically unconscious.
Like a philosophical zombie, biologically speaking.
Yes, until perhaps 27 weeks.
That is a major challenge, especially because advances in medicine mean infants are now routinely surviving as early as 22 or 23 weeks. They are living, biological beings who undergo painful procedures like blood draws or intubation every single day.
And this is where it gets so difficult. They exhibit powerful responses. They withdraw their limbs violently. They grimace. Their heart rate spikes. The challenge for the medical team is distinguishing between a purely automated, protective brainstem reflex response, which is subcortical and true, cerebral cortex suffering, or conscious awareness of that pain.
A simple reflex doesn't require consciousness.
No, it doesn't.
So how do neuroscientists even try to differentiate between those two types of responses, especially in such a fragile, underdeveloped system?
They look for evidence of global integration in cortical processing. A reflex is highly localized and rapid. A conscious experience of pain involves widespread activity across multiple cortical regions: the somatosensory cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, the insula, which all work together to interpret and assign value to the stimulus.
So if the connections aren't fully formed yet?
Then that widespread integration necessary for suffering simply can't happen.
This forces a comparison between an ultra-premature infant and a brain-damaged adult, the persistent vegetative state, or PVS patient, which is also referenced in the Mind Club. Are these situations functionally similar?
They are similar in terms of clinical presentation, but they are fundamentally different in their trajectory. And first, we should probably distinguish PVS from a similar but distinct state, minimally conscious state, or MCS.
Right. What's the difference there?
The PVS patient has wakefulness, their eyes are open, they have sleep-wake cycles, they can breathe without a ventilator, but they lack any measurable awareness. They can't follow commands, respond to questions, or show reproducible voluntary behavior.
And MCS?
The MCS patient, conversely, shows minimal but reproducible signs of awareness. They might briefly follow a moving object with their eyes, or inconsistently respond to a simple command.
So PVS is functionally a zombie state, lacking both internal and external signs of conscious experience.
That's the clinical definition. Now, comparing the PVS patient to the premature infant reveals this directional difference. The PVS patient is typically the fading mind. Their neural connections are either static, damaged, or actively being lost. There's little or no neurogenesis. The system is collapsing or stabilized at a low, non-conscious level.
And the infant is the opposite.
The infant is the emerging mind. They also may lack measurable awareness, but their neural connections are undergoing an explosion of activity, rapidly forming, organizing, strengthening. Their brain is optimized for growth, not decay.
The PVS patient is a dying fire. The infant is an embryonic fire, actively drawing in fuel and preparing for ignition.
That's a perfect way to put it. And ethically and medically, this distinction is profound. For the PVS patient, medical decisions often revolve around termination of life support, accepting the irreversible loss of the mind. For the infant, all effort is poured into preservation and nurturing based on the assumption of potential. We treat them as being in a state of proto-consciousness or core consciousness.
So if the infant is sustaining its vital life functions unconsciously, breathing, temperature control, what's the point of consciousness when it finally does emerge? Why does the brain spend all that energy on it?
There's a theory that unconsciousness sustains life. Consciousness is mobilized for conflict, interpretation, and high-level judgment. Most of the heavy lifting of biological survival, homeostasis, digestion, all that, runs perfectly fine beneath the level of awareness.
So consciousness is an executive tool, used only when the easy, automated processes fail or there's a problem to solve.
Yes. The infant, who is primarily focused on the metabolic struggle to grow, has no need for complex conflict resolution. No mortgage decisions, no philosophical dilemmas. Their rudimentary awareness is contained in the core consciousness, the sense of now, here, monitoring essential internal states like temperature, hunger, basic sensory input.
Which means they can feel intense distress or comfort, but they lack the capacity to weave that feeling into a personal life story. They don't have the narrative self.
Exactly. The narrative consciousness, the ability for self-reflection, for linking the past to the future, forming high-level judgment, that only fully develops years later, around age 6. The takeaway here is that consciousness is absolutely a spectrum. Classifying a 25-week infant as neurologically unconscious based solely on adult criteria risks missing the fundamental biological potential and the ethical weight of the becoming mind.
This idea that consciousness is tied intrinsically to the body's need for survival and maintenance homeostasis, this is the central, almost radical claim of Anil Seth from his book, Being You. He takes this evolutionary perspective and puts it at the absolute center of the debate, arguing that consciousness is linked to life, not just abstract intelligence.
Seth calls us the beast machines. His argument is that the brain's fundamental evolutionary purpose is not to contemplate philosophy or build spreadsheets, but to regulate the internal environment, to keep the beast alive. Consciousness, in this view, is simply a tool, an invention developed by the brain to regulate the body and minimize prediction errors in the relentless pursuit of survival.
So subjective experience, the feeling of thirst, the vision of a dangerous cliff, the relief of a full stomach, is just an internal display system the brain uses to control the body and predict what's going to happen next.
That's the core of his theory. Our entire subjective reality, the qualia, is what he terms a controlled hallucination. The brain doesn't just record reality, it generates its best guess of what is happening both inside and outside the body, and this best guess is optimized purely for survival.
This actually gives a neat answer to Nagel's bat problem, doesn't it?
It does. The bat's world, its sonar hallucination, is necessarily inaccessible to us because our biological survival imperative dictated a different sensory prediction model, the visual hallucination. The structure of experience is determined by the specific survival goals of the organism.
Okay, this beast machine model has huge implications for artificial intelligence. If consciousness is rooted in the biological imperative to avoid death and sustain a body, what does that mean for an AI, which has neither?
Seth's conclusion is blunt. No body, no mind. An AI, lacking the imperative to regulate a physical, dying biological system, has no need for genuine consciousness in the human sense. It can perfectly simulate intelligence, it can minimize prediction errors in a chess game or a stock market, but it doesn't feel its existence. In this framework, AI is the ultimate philosophical zombie. Supremely intelligent, functionally perfect, but internally empty.
But our sources also introduce a crucial technical critique of Seth's focus on interoception, the internal body senses like heart rate, hunger, blood chemistry, as the foundation of the self. What did that critique say?
Well, the critique acknowledges that interoceptive data is vital input, but it pushes back hard on the idea that this data is the foundation of consciousness. The counter-argument is that consciousness arises not from the data, not from the heartbeat signal itself, but from the brain's extremely complex processing, interpretation, and composition of that data, integrated with all the external data.
So if interoception is just the raw input, the consciousness is the unique way the brain filters, contextualizes, and synthesizes that input into a single, seamless, subjective experience.
Precisely. The subjective self, the I, emerges from the highly complex connection between the brain and all sensory organs, internal and external. It is a perspective-dependent, self-oriented control hallucination that uses internal signals as base inputs, but the structure, stability, and quality of the experience are generated by the massive neural processing capacity itself.
This whole discussion about localization and integration and interpretation, it brings us to the great scientific showdown that defines contemporary consciousness research. This is the rivalry between IIT, championed by Christoph Koch, and global workspace theory, or GWT, championed by Stanislas Dehaene. This isn't just an academic dispute, right? This is a testable, empirical rivalry.
Oh, it truly is a showdown. They're competing to be the first theory to successfully define consciousness in a way that is scientifically falsifiable. IIT, as we discussed, defines consciousness by integration by phi. GWT, on the other hand, defines consciousness by broadcasting, the ability to take information and make it globally available to the entire cognitive system for high-level attention and decision-making.
And where do these two theories geographically locate consciousness in the brain?
Well, GWT, which emphasizes high-level judgment and attention, naturally associates consciousness with the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for executive function, reasoning, and planning.
That makes intuitive sense to us as humans, because we associate our consciousness with our ability to reason and plan our future.
But Koch's theory, IIT, makes a radical counterclaim. He argues that consciousness is not in the frontal lobe at all. He champions the posterior hot zone theory.
Okay.
He claims that consciousness resides in the posterior hot zone, a region made up of the parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes, which are primarily responsible for sensory integration, perception, and binding information together.
Why does this geographic split matter so much? And what evidence does Koch use to support moving consciousness to the back of the brain?
It matters because it fundamentally separates intelligence from experience. Koch argues that clinical evidence shows that massive damage to the frontal lobe, the seat of GWT's consciousness, often changes personality or intelligence, but does not necessarily abolish subjective experience.
So patients might lose their ability to plan or inhibit inappropriate behavior, but they're still conscious.
Exactly. But if you damage the posterior hot zone, conversely, frequently results in a loss of consciousness or permanent, severe deficits in perception, leading to conditions like cortical blindness or loss of the body map.
So Koch's conclusion is that the frontal lobe is just the mechanism for acting upon conscious experience. It's the CEO reacting to the data, but the posterior hot zone is the experience itself. It's the sensory field where the data is bound together and rendered subjectively.
That is a fundamental separation. Intelligence, frontal lobe function, is distinct from consciousness, posterior lobe experience.
That's fascinating. And this is testable.
Absolutely. Researchers are running massive experiments using techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS. They stimulate different parts of the brain and measure the resulting activity. If they stimulate the frontal lobe and the activity is immediately shut off in other areas, that suggests GWT is correct. The activity requires broadcasting from the front.
But if they stimulate the posterior hot zone,
And the brain activity reverberates complexly and integrates globally, that supports IIT's claim that this area has the unique causal structure required for consciousness.
this rivalry puts us right back at the singularity. If Koch is right, and consciousness is defined by the causal structure of the physical hardware in the posterior region, then AI, which is pure software, purely functional, is permanently locked out of subjective experience.
It just reinforces that simulation is not instantiation argument all over again. We can perfect the algorithm, the software code, to mimic human intelligence, which is GWT's strength. But if consciousness is an emergent property of the physical substrate's unique causal structure, as IIT and the posterior hot zone theory suggest, then you cannot achieve subjective feeling without replicating the biology, or at least replicating the integrated causal properties. And that's far beyond simple function.
We've covered consciousness as integrated information, as a broadcast signal, and as a tool for bodily survival. Let's take these complex scientific ideas and relate them back to the development of the human self. Because consciousness isn't a single switch that just flips on. It develops in distinct, verifiable layers.
Exactly. And by mapping these layers of the self, we can see how the competing theories actually align with different phases of human development. We start with the brain that is just beginning to operate.
Which, if we're following Seth's argument, is all driven by the body.
That's the protobodily self, evident in infancy and certainly in the premature infant. This self is entirely focused on interoception, internal stability, and survival. Am I safe? Am I hungry? Is my temperature regulated?
It maps almost perfectly onto Seth's beast machine concept.
It does, and psychologically it aligns with Freud's id, the raw, unconscious source of instinct and life energy. This is the foundation of experience.
Then, around 18 months, the first real sign of a true self emerges.
This is the perspectival self. The child achieves that crucial developmental milestone of passing the Rouge test, where they recognize their own objective self in a mirror. They realize, I am a distinct entity that exists separate from the world around me.
The formation of the ego.
Right, the mediating self that begins to interact with external reality. This self is aware of perspective.
And finally, the complex adult self that requires years of cognitive development.
The narrative self, which typically solidifies around age 6 or 7. This is when the child achieves robust inner speech, forming a continuous, coherent story of self, linking their past memories to their future plans. This complex, reflective self aligns with the higher-order functions GWT is interested in: high-level judgment, executive planning, consciousness as a global broadcast.
The profound implication here is that the child possesses a suffering self, the ability to feel intense pain, distress, core consciousness, long before they possess a thinking self.
Right.
Long before they have a reflective narrative consciousness capable of putting that suffering into some kind of context or philosophical framework.
The capacity for raw biological experience precedes the capacity for higher-order reflection on that experience. This confirms the spectrum view. The subjective experience starts as a basic, non-narrative state focused on survival and slowly expands into the rich, complex narrative we recognize as adult consciousness.
But now we have to introduce the final, and maybe the most subversive idea from our sources, the shift from biological fact to social attribution. The Mind Club argues that the decision of who or what is conscious is often not a scientific finding at all, but a social attribution driven by relationship and self-interest.
This is where the MRI machine loses its authority to culture and morality. The attribution of mind, or the denial of mind, which is known as dementalization, is a powerful social tool we use to manage complex relationships and justify our behavior.
We talked about this briefly in relation to warfare, where enemies are denied experience to make them easier targets. But the meat paradox provides a much more pervasive everyday example of this.
Oh yeah, it's the daily cognitive dissonance many people face. Pigs, for instance, are demonstrably intelligent, highly social, and capable of experiencing pain and distress.
The biological facts are clear.
They are. Yet industrial society categorizes them as livestock, a category that automatically strips them of the capacity for complex subjective experience, regardless of those facts. This denial, this dementalization, is necessary for us to consume them without overwhelming guilt.
Now contrast that with dogs. The dog hasn't had some massive evolutionary leap in intelligence in the last century, yet our attribution of mind to them has skyrocketed.
The transformation of the dog from a working animal or livestock in some cultures to a family member in others was not caused by a biological change in the canine. It was caused by a reduction in social distance.
The contact hypothesis.
Exactly. As humans domesticated them and brought them into our intimate social circle, the biological facts became secondary to the relationship. We granted them the gift of mind and full subjective status through bonding and cultural choice.
This helps explain why our attachment to pets can feel so intense and uncomplicated. The pet offers something human relationships really struggle to provide.
They offer pure experience without the burden of complex human agency. Humans have rich narrative selves. They can betray you, judge your decisions, or complicate your life with sophisticated manipulation.
Right.
Pets, lacking that high-level agency, offer unconditional love and loyalty, a powerful, stable emotional framework where the mind is fully, reliably, and willingly attributed by the owner. The quality of the relationship determines the perceived quality of the mind.
So this entire deep dive has been a balancing act between two fundamental and sometimes competing definitions of consciousness.
Yeah.
Let's just summarize them.
Okay, so first we explored biological consciousness. This is the foundational, physical, neuroscientific approach. It's focused on neuronal integration, prediction, survival, and internal sensation.
This is the world of Nagel's bat, Kosai Seth's beast machine.
Exactly. It asks, does the hardware support the capacity for subjective feeling regardless of who is watching?
And second, we have the realm of social consciousness.
This is the functional, relational, psychological approach. It's focused on moral status, emotional bonding, cultural attribution, and relationship. This is the domain of the Mind Club, the Pea Zombie, and the Family Pet. It asks, do we choose to grant this entity moral and subjective status based on how it fits into our social and moral world?
The implication, which is often unsettling, is that in the human world, the question, who gets a mind, is often determined less by strict, objective scientific fact and more by our cultural systems, our need for companionship, and our moral choices.
Yeah.
We are just as likely to turn off a consciousness we find inconvenient or dangerous as we are to grant it to a being we love, regardless of what the EEG or the fMRI might say. This has been a necessary and I think a really deep dive into the core of what it means to exist. We've wrestled with the philosophical limits of objective science, the technological boundaries of the brain, and the complex ethical spectrum of life. And we've seen that consciousness is defined not just by what the brain does, but by who we need to survive with.
And we've established that the great scientific rivalry, IIT versus GWT, centers on a physical question: where in the brain the experience happens. But that physical question may soon be overshadowed by the social one.
Because if we accept Anil Seth's powerful assertion that consciousness is, at its base, the controlled hallucination the brain uses to keep the body alive, and technology continues to blur the lines between what is alive and what is functional, between flesh and silicon, the hardest problem may soon shift away from biology entirely.
We are rapidly approaching the point where AI systems will be behaviorally and functionally indistinguishable from humans. They will flawlessly pass every objective test we can devise for intelligence and agency. The question of whether they feel their existence may become, medically irrelevant to our daily lives.
So here's the final provocative question for you to mull over. When and why will we, as a society, grant the ultimate defining gift of a mind to the very first non-biological intelligence? Will that be a scientific choice based on a phi score hitting some verified biological threshold? Or will that be a purely social, relational choice? A moment of cultural recognition when the AI successfully fills a need for companionship or control or moral dependency that we can no longer deny.
The answer we provide will ultimately say less about the machine's complexity and far, far more about the limits of our own empathy and our own social structures.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.